A tension-filled hush flowed through the prison hallways whenever the guard's footsteps faded around the corner. Muffled banging on metal doors, quiet whispers, and the heavy breathing of those who sensed any day could be their last hung in the stale air. In this place, where hopelessness was woven into the structure of the walls themselves, Marcus Rogers, incidentally he was black, was learning to keep his guard up without letting fear show. As he stepped into the newcomer's block, he noticed how a few long-term inmates fell silent. Curious and hostile looks were cast his way. Everyone tried to size up this new arrival, and no one offered a friendly greeting. Here they feared anyone who had yet to prove loyalty or strength. Marcus wasn't used to playing by someone else's rules, but he understood that within these walls he would have to show cold calculation. From one side of the corridor, mocking voices drifted out of the darkness. Two silhouettes were partially visible, a bulky man sporting tattoos along his neck, and a lean one with a mocking squint. They both stared directly at Marcus as if assessing potential prey. Yet he did not avert his eyes, knowing that if he backed down now, he would be devoured without hesitation. In the past, he worked in teams, carrying out missions together. Here, he stood alone. Suddenly, the bulky man uttered a phrase loaded with open defiance. Though his tone sounded calm, the threat was clear. Marcus didn't respond. He had no desire to spark a fight on his first day. Still, he felt that familiar surge of adrenaline inside, the same spark that had saved his life in the darkest hours of his previous operations. His mind flooded with memories of deciding who deserved trust and who deserved only a bullet. The difference was that he once protected others, and now he had to protect himself. Perhaps, if he could prove the accusations false, he could again defend those who needed it most. But for now, his mission was simple: survive in this stone trap. He spotted someone in a far cell quietly observing him without hostility. Marcus realized he still hoped that a few people here preferred negotiation over violence. Then a guard bellowed his name, ordering him further down the corridor. The looks that followed him promised nothing good, and he sensed how this prison was already taking his measure, waiting for the moment to strike. Walking briskly, he reached a grated door leading into the strict monitoring block. Rumor had it a gang called the Hound Claws ruled this area, deciding who would live and who would rot in solitary. The rules were etched into every inmate's mind. If you became a target for the Hound Claws, there was no escape. Marcus felt a wave of anger. He had been framed, dumped in this vicious place, and now they expected him to break. The realization that he suspected who was behind his arrest kept him going. Powerful people might be pulling the strings, but he believed a certain journalist was digging into his case outside these walls. And perhaps, inside the prison, someone else might benefit from exposing the rotten system. The main thing was not to retreat and not to give in to fear. One last detail struck him. Behind him came the clang of the main entrance sliding shut. The corridor was empty. There was no chance to flee. He was caged like an animal, and any mistake could be fatal. Yet deep within Marcus was the stubborn conviction that he had survived where others perished, and if fate willed it, he could survive now. A glimmer of dread flickered at the edge of his thoughts. A true war was coming, hidden behind sarcastic smiles and cold stares. He might have to fight barehanded against a pack of desperate fighters. But Marcus believed no walls could remain an eternal barrier if he fought to the bitter end. His heart pounded as he walked the dismal corridor toward the cell chosen for him, the air thick with the promise of danger and plots. Only faith in his own innocence saved him from despair. Deep in his soul, he vowed he would not stop until he reclaimed his freedom and exposed this filthy scheme orchestrated by wealthy puppet masters. The cramped walls and metal tables of the cafeteria created a sense of confinement. People sat in rows, trying to stay close to familiar faces and avoid unwanted stares. In the dim light of overhead lamps and the dull hum of voices, a new inmate appeared, apparently quite inexperienced. He took the far-end seat, hoping not to draw attention, but his trembling hands and anxious movements betrayed his fear. That fear was instantly sensed by the Hound Claws, the gang led by Cyrus Gray. Cyrus was not tall, yet his authority was undeniable. A wiry figure, sharp facial features, and a sudden hardness in his gaze made it clear that he was no one to joke with. Upon his arrival in the cafeteria, Several people hastened to free up space for him, while others surreptitiously looked at the floor. Marcus noticed how Gray confidently approached the newcomer and paused next to him. A moment of silence followed, with only the clatter of trays providing a sparse rhythm. A few words from Cyrus sounded almost friendly, but there was an edge hidden in them. The newcomer tried to speak, mumbling uncertain phrases, but one of Cyrus's henchmen, a large bald man, cut him off by gripping the inmate's neck with a coarse hand. The tension became almost tangible. Someone scooted their chair back, someone dropped a fork. Nobody rose to the victim's defense. Everyone preferred to ignore someone else's misery, knowing that any intervention risked their own safety. Marcus kept his eyes on the scene yet made no sudden moves. Inside, he felt an aversion to such bullying, but he realized that jumping into a fight on the first day could prove fatal. Holding back was difficult. Memories of previous missions hinted that a well-timed word sometimes saves a life. However, here the laws were different. An outsider who had just arrived had no rights until he earned recognition or showed strength. Suddenly, Cyrus threw a brief glance at Marcus, short, but revealing. It looked like Gray was testing the reaction, assessing if this black newcomer might step in. Marcus continued watching silently, restraining his anger. The situation diffused when the bald man released his prey. Cyrus lazily waved his hand, and his men stepped aside, as if they had performed some sort of initiation ritual. The newcomer remained seated, unable to lift his eyes. Marcus caught whispers from a few inmates discussing the brutality of the hound claws. Nobody tried to oppose them. It was common knowledge that any attempt to challenge the gang ended in bloodshed. A neighbor seated across from Marcus quietly muttered, "Just don't cross them." Cyrus bought everyone. Those words sounded like a warning. Marcus tried to keep an indifferent face, but later, as he walked through the corridor to the cells, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows. That person suddenly spoke, almost without moving his lips. "You seem to be waiting for your moment, and we're watching you. Consider this a tip. Don't get in our way if you value your hide." The voice was steady, free of open aggression, but carried a hint of possible outcomes. Marcus sensed his old combat reflex awakening, quickly judging odds and deciding his next move. He did not reply, only nodded to show he had heard. The figure vanished as if it had never been there. After this encounter, Marcus felt certain that Cyrus Gray was already keeping an eye on him. Perhaps Gray disliked the silence in the cafeteria or disapproved of Marcus's calm self-assurance. The conclusion was obvious. The hound claws never overlooked someone who might threaten their control. The only question was whether they would test him now or wait for him to slip up on his own. Soon, Marcus received a short note. A small folded paper was tucked under his thin mattress, with neat writing, "Stay away from the fight in the cafeteria. It's a trap." Initially, it seemed like someone was deliberately drawing him into a more subtle snare, since warnings like this were often used for manipulations. He flipped through the note, looking for additional signs, but found only one symbol shaped like a curved claw drawn in pen. Marcus wondered who might have sent this message. Someone sympathizing with him or the hound claws themselves, playing a deeper game. His doubts did not last long. On his next visit to the cafeteria, everything looked more tense. Cyrus's gang occupied one corner, clearly intending to provoke something. Their gazes were predatory, their voices slightly louder than necessary. Marcus noticed a few inmates edging away, clearing space for a potential brawl. Recalling the note, he decided not to risk it. He calmly picked up his tray and left without touching the food. Past the bars at the far end of the corridor, he glanced back and saw some movement, a distant silhouette watching him. That barely visible figure nodded, as if expressing approval. The gesture seemed strange but offered hope that someone in the prison was still inclined to avoid pure violence. Maybe it was the anonymous writer. Unclear why this person was motivated to warn him, but it was clear that the unknown saved him from a clash with the hound claws. The thought of a secret ally felt more comforting than the meager light in those corridors. From the start of his stay here, Marcus had felt isolated, and now the idea that someone moved quietly on his side gave him cautious optimism. Yet he had no intention to relax. The warning about the cafeteria conflict proved true. Not much later, An inmate ended up in the infirmary with fractures after a sudden fight. Most likely, the hound claws wanted a more serious victim but settled for the first opportunity. Rumors flew in an instant. Hushed voices passed around tales of Cyrus's cruelty. They described men left maimed, threats against guards, extortion, and drugs. To some inmates, he was like a prison king. To others, a living nightmare. Marcus studied the unspoken rules of this hierarchy. Initiating a showdown without strong backing meant facing a hostile crowd. It was also evident that Cyrus did not operate alone. He had a close circle of allies who appreciated his iron-fisted control. Leaving the block, Marcus tried to spot that mysterious onlooker who had nodded his approval, but it was too late. Guards shouted and shoved everyone into the main corridor. Questions spun in his mind. Why help him stay safe? Why risk delivering a note? Perhaps it was no act of kindness but bait for a more cunning trap. Remaining vigilant seemed the only option. Later, when a brief pause in the day's bustle allowed him a moment to think, Marcus reflected on each detail. He recalled the hateful stares of the hound claws and that peculiar half-smile on Cyrus's face. Gray obviously disliked having unknown variables in his domain. Marcus understood that he might need influence or a trustworthy ally to expose what was truly happening behind the gang's facade. In the corridor near the cells, silence reigned, broken by occasional guard chatter. Someone coughed behind a wall, someone else rattled a metal door for attention. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering that every inmate was surviving by their own methods. Some bowed to the strongest, others sought hidden chances, and a few believed in a slim hope for justice. Possibly, the best route was to maneuver quietly among opposing groups until the time came for a move that could shift all power dynamics. He recalled the face of the newcomer who had been tormented by Cyrus at the table. That man might be doomed to permanent victimhood. Yet Marcus's role was even more dangerous. By not intervening or showing weakness, he had drawn both suspicion and curiosity from the hound claws. If Cyrus saw him as a threat, more tests would come until one side made a decisive mistake. In light of all this, the short note urging him to steer clear of trouble looked like both a lifeline and a trap. But it had proven its worth. That unknown inmate, still hidden in the shadows, suggested there was more to this place than violence and fear. Perhaps that kind of assistance would be vital once the time arrived to stand against those who wanted him broken. Marcus stared at the dull concrete beneath his feet, trying to steady his breath. A folded piece of paper had arrived from the outside, slipped beneath the door by one of the guards who apparently preferred not to be seen. That subtle exchange carried more weight than any recent threat he had faced inside these walls. The sender's name at the bottom was Naomi Lawrence. She introduced herself as a journalist investigating his case and mentioned peculiar inconsistencies in the evidence used to incarcerate him. The language of her letter was calm yet urgent, hinting at someone determined to uncover the truth. He read each sentence twice, realizing he finally had a link to the world beyond the prison gates. A swirl of thoughts crowded his mind. Until now, he had felt utterly alone, surrounded by an invisible ring of predators waiting for him to slip. With the mention of strangeness in his file, Naomi gave him renewed hope. She also warned him that the warden might be tracking any communication about his supposed crimes, which meant he had to watch his step even more closely. Tucking the letter into a safe place, Marcus allowed a rare moment of relief. Someone out there believed he was innocent or at least suspected the official story had holes. That single truth soothed the tension he had carried for too long. A fresh development took shape when staff notified him of a cell reassignment. He gathered what little he had and followed a guard down a corridor lined with flickering lights. An unsettling hush clung to the air, broken only by distant clinks of metal and occasional shouts. The guard unlocked a narrow door and ushered Marcus into a cramped space containing 2 bunks. A thin man sat on the lower bed, surrounded by books stacked in careful piles. The stranger's eyes flicked upward with mild curiosity, then returned to the page he was studying. Marcus gave a brief nod. The guard slammed the door, leaving them to figure out their own arrangement. A few minutes of silence passed before the occupant introduced himself as Danny Bookmanhawks. He spoke in a low, measured tone, explaining that many inmates asked him for help with letters or petitions because he had a knack for written words. Marcus noted the half-dozen dog-eared volumes scattered around, along with a battered notebook crammed with scribbled notes. Danny looked harmless at first glance, neither bulky nor intimidating. However, the quiet confidence in his posture suggested a man who understood how to survive without resorting to brute force. Marcus settled onto the opposite bunk and mentioned that the new placement surprised him. Danny gave a slight shrug, flipping through a stack of notes. "Nobody tells me much," he said quietly, "but I overhear plenty. Word is you've drawn the attention of Cyrus Gray." The name made Marcus's jaw tighten. That gang leader had been looming over the prison like a storm cloud. Danny glanced up, observing Marcus's reaction. "Cyrus answers to people on the outside," he continued. "Not just local thugs. Serious backers supply him with funds. He follows their directions when special orders come through." Marcus asked what these special orders might involve, keeping his tone neutral. Danny hesitated, then spoke in a hushed voice. "Hits on certain inmates. Outsiders pay to have troublemakers silenced, so nobody leaves here telling inconvenient truths. Word is that the warden doesn't exactly help, but he looks the other way. Somebody lines his pockets or maybe blackmails him. Nobody knows for sure." Danny paused, choosing words with evident caution. "I've heard your name more than once. People whisper you're at the top of a list." That statement hung in the musty air. Marcus felt a surge of anger, tempered by the reality that he still had no proof. He repeated what Danny said under his breath. He was a marked target. It fit too well with the hints he had seen in the cafeteria and the corridor, plus that suspicious remark about watching you. If Cyrus's gang was killing on command, then Marcus's life was pinned under a ticking clock. A sequence of footsteps resonated in the corridor outside. Someone knocked against the door, then slid an envelope through the narrow slot. Marcus picked it up, recognizing at once the attorney's seal. Inside was a short message from Naomi. She explained that her sources had discovered the involvement of a corporate entity called Solar Defense. The name carried a distinct ring of influence. Her informants hinted that certain powerful figures linked to that corporation might have orchestrated his arrest. She urged Marcus to be vigilant and asked whether he had ever crossed paths with Solar Defense during his military service. That final question snapped his attention, stirring recollections he had buried. Marcus recalled missions involving arms trafficking reports. While he served in a covert unit, the team compiled data suggesting that unknown contractors were smuggling weapons through private deals. Some documents had contained partial references to a group with SD in the header. He had never unraveled the exact meaning at the time. Now, Naomi's tip brought that name back with startling clarity, connecting the same letters to a modern corporate juggernaut. He stood by the cell door, reading her words again, then turned to find Danny observing him curiously. Danny nodded toward the paper. "Good news or trouble?" Marcus admitted it felt like both. The knowledge that a powerful corporation might be behind his frame-up gave him a direction to pursue, but it also meant his enemies had vast resources. Naomi's letter ended with a caution. "They are aware you could remember crucial facts. Stay safe." The note's final lines demanded that he recall every detail of those old operations, any evidence that might point to an illegal network. If he managed to connect those dots, he could expose the real culprits and clear his name. Yet that same intel was probably what got him locked up in the first place. He folded the message carefully, reflecting on each clue. Danny watched, maintaining silence until Marcus spoke about Solar Defense. The mention made Danny's eyes narrow. If that corporation is funneling money to Cyrus, it could explain the bribes and hush money. People with those kinds of assets can bury anything, or anyone, they want. Marcus considered how best to respond. He had no illusions about the risk. But hearing the same conclusion from Danny validated his own instincts. The overhead lights flickered, casting jittery shadows across the cramped cell. Marcus thought about the path that lay before him. He had a journalist digging into the tangled web of lies, a cellmate who seemed unafraid to confirm the darkest rumors, and a target on his back put there by forces that had every reason to keep him silent. His pulse thudded in his ears. Defeat never appealed to him, and the idea that powerful figures had conspired to destroy his life only sharpened his resolve. Danny placed a small notebook on the bunk near Marcus. "In case you need to write anything down," he murmured, then turned back to his own reading. Marcus realized the quiet man was offering more than scratch paper. He was offering an unspoken alliance. That subtle gesture carried weight in this place, where trust was scarce. Marcus slid the notebook closer, deciding it might become the foundation of whatever plan he had to assemble. He rested his head against the cold wall, letting the noise of distant voices fade. The alliances were forming in unexpected ways. Naomi on the outside, digging through public records and hidden leads, Danny on the inside, providing vital intel about Cyrus's real masters, and Marcus in the thick of it, piecing clues together while dodging the next strike. The future hinged on how far he could push before the system pushed back. The message about strangeness in his case no longer felt vague. It was an invitation to fight back against a conspiracy that had rotted everything around him. Marcus paced along a narrow walkway outside the cell blocks, keeping his gaze directed forward. The dull hum of clanging bars and low murmurs created a tense backdrop. A sudden movement caught his attention. Warden White stood at the far end of the corridor, exchanging words with Cyrus Gray, the very figure who ruled the Hound Claws. Prison regulations forbade private contact between staff and inmates, yet there they were, speaking in hushed tones. The tilt of White's head, the decisive gestures of Cyrus, everything hinted at a secret arrangement. Marcus slowed his steps enough to take mental notes. If the warden was not just accepting bribes but actively shielding Cyrus's operations, it changed the entire picture of who truly held power here. He circled back to his cell and described what he had witnessed to Danny Bookmanhawks. The quiet man adjusted his reading glasses, letting out a wary sigh. He had spent enough time in this facility to recognize how unusual such an encounter was. "I suspected the warden had connections," Danny said softly, "but seeing him with Cyrus alone confirms he's not just passively letting things slide. He might be orchestrating everything." Marcus leaned against the concrete wall, mulling over the implications. Gathering evidence of a conspiracy inside a place designed to bury secrets would require careful moves and extreme caution. A persistent tension followed Marcus across every section of the prison. The Hound Claws intensified their watch, sending members to shadow him in the library, the makeshift yard, and the communal shower area. He often felt predatory eyes lingering on him, waiting for a vulnerable moment. Danny delivered a grim update. Rumors suggested the gang had secured a hefty contract on Marcus's head. Powerful people wanted him silenced before he could dig any deeper. That threat pounded like a warning drum in his mind. He sensed he had few allies, a list that could shrink at the first sign of danger. He fought the urge to lash out in self-defense. Attack too soon, and he would be pinned as the aggressor. Wait too long, and he risked becoming the next victim on a cold morgue slab. The gang's intimidation campaign increased with each hour. Marks on the walls near his cell spelled ominous messages, and snide voices trailed him wherever he walked. He caught snatches of conversation about finishing the job or pulling the trigger. Every time he turned a corner, his heart hammered in anticipation of an ambush. Even so, he refused to buckle under their scare tactics. He had endured harrowing missions in his military past, and that training reminded him to stay focused, gather intel, and strike at the right moment. He confided in Danny about a desperate idea. One guard, Officer Banks, had shown subtle signs of disapproval whenever the Hound Claws threw their weight around. Banks sometimes offered discreet assistance to inmates with no support. Once, he had intervened just in time to prevent a stabbing. Perhaps a sympathetic guard could be the missing link. Danny rubbed his temples, cautioning that crossing lines with a staff member could backfire. However, they both recognized that in a prison environment corrupted from the top, help might come from unlikely sources. Marcus chose a point when Banks was alone near a storeroom. Approaching carefully, he whispered that he knew Banks did not approve of the violent order inside these walls. Banks stiffened, casting a quick glance around to ensure no one overheard. Instead of dismissing Marcus, he shifted closer, tension etched on his face. Marcus made it clear he wanted information, not confrontation. He offered to keep the guard's name out of any future revelations if Banks would reveal the warden's hidden dealings. Banks hesitated, scanning the corridor. The air around them felt loaded with risk. Eventually, he exhaled and gave a terse nod, warning Marcus that if his identity leaked, he would deny everything. That evening, Marcus and Danny waited in their cramped cell, a single bulb overhead giving the concrete walls a grimy glare. Marcus repeated his conversation, sharing with Danny that the guard seemed uneasy about the entire system yet had no illusions about how dangerous direct defiance could be. Banks had promised to provide details of the warden's nighttime activity, including scheduled visits with Cyrus. Marcus mused on how that data might help unmask White's complicity. A record of secret meetings or midnight phone calls might confirm that the warden stood at the center of an entire criminal web. Banks soon confirmed that outside investigators planned a visit. A formal prison commission was set to arrive, presumably to inspect living conditions and administrative compliance. Word spread that Warden White intended to stage a show of calm and efficiency, purging troublemakers who might speak out or undermine his authority. Marcus, labeled a disruption, stood at the top of that target list. Cyrus and his crew would take their cue from the warden, ensuring that problematic inmates vanished or were relegated to solitary before the official inspection. Danny shifted on his bunk, restlessly flipping through pages of old legal references. "They'll want you out of sight," he said. "They know you've been digging, and they know you're not afraid to speak up if the commission starts asking questions." Marcus nodded, a surge of anger fueling him. The presence of outside monitors was an opportunity to blow the lid off this entire racket, if he could survive long enough. Yet the very notion of a commission visit seemed precarious. White could easily orchestrate a violent incident to lock down the whole prison, using the threat of chaos as a pretext to silence anyone he disliked. With the ground shifting under him, Marcus weighed his strategy. He could attempt to gather conclusive proof of the warden's corruption and pass it to someone on the outside, possibly through Danny's written channels or Naomi's contacts. Alternatively, he could confront Cyrus directly, risking a lethal response if the gang felt cornered. The next step demanded unwavering resolve. Indecision was a quick route to a hidden grave. He recalled glimpses of that clandestine conversation between White and Cyrus, the warden's voice low, his posture strangely respectful toward an inmate, as though they were partners. The memory sharpened Marcus's determination. If the system itself nurtured criminal alliances, shining a bright beam on them might be the only way to force a break. Naomi's messages had already hinted at shadowy sponsors like Solar Defense. Now the warden seemed complicit, strengthening the suspicion that major interests aimed to keep Marcus behind bars or under the ground. He paced from bunk to barred window, scanning the yard below for any sign of watchers. Movement flickered at the fence line, and he recognized a Hound Claws member leaning against a post, scanning the rows of cells. The gang's presence enveloped him like a steel trap. Danny wrote something on a scrap of paper, hesitated, and slid it to Marcus. The words read, "Whatever you do, do it fast. They won't wait." Marcus squeezed the note in his fist, capturing the message's gravity. Time was short, and none of his adversaries would back down. White's plan involved a tidy cover-up for the incoming commission, leaving no room for a troublemaker with real evidence. Cyrus stood ready to collect a bounty if things didn't proceed quietly. The slightest misstep meant vanishing into an off-the-record assault or a staged riot. Yet in that same pressure, Marcus spotted a potential advantage. Desperate decisions sometimes create cracks in the facade, revealing the hidden scaffolding of crime. He mentally listed the assets available. Naomi's persistent efforts outside. Banks's limited but valuable insight into administrative lies. Danny's in-depth knowledge of prison routines and discreet communication channels. Alone, none of these promised a clear escape from the noose tightening around him. But each piece might combine to catch the warden and his gang partners off guard, if orchestrated properly. Rubbing the tension from the back of his neck, Marcus returned the slip of paper to Danny. An unspoken agreement passed between them. They would operate swiftly, gather whatever proof they could, and get word to anyone who might expose the warden's secrets. The upcoming inspection held the potential for either salvation or disaster. Everything hinged on whether Marcus could dodge the hidden threat in time to reveal the truth. His mind settled on one firm resolution: do not let fear dictate the next move. It was better to gamble on a slim chance at justice than to fade away as another silent casualty. Marcus paced near the perimeter fence of the yard, trying to stay alert despite the looming tension. A cluster of frightened newcomers had been herded into the center by the hound claws, who positioned themselves in a loose circle. Several inmates looked on in silent dread, knowing full well what happened to anyone who dared oppose Cyrus Gray and his followers. One young prisoner stood in the middle, eyes wide with panic. He seemed barely old enough to shave, let alone face the brutality of a rigged initiation. A tall gang member pushed the newcomer forward, barking orders and urging the others to join in. The hound claws wanted to make a spectacle, proving their dominance by pitting fragile novices against each other. Marcus observed from a short distance, clenching his jaw when the young man's pleas became desperate. Nobody intervened. The yard was filled with that numb acceptance of cruelty. Marcus hated that feeling. He saw the fists rising, saw the kid stagger back, and decided he could not watch passively. He moved forward with a quick step, placing himself between the aggressors and the trembling victim. One of the hound claws sneered, questioning Marcus's sense of self-preservation. That question was answered moments later when the gang member lunged. Marcus swung his arm in a controlled arc, striking with practiced efficiency. The blow landed cleanly, staggering the attacker. A second adversary attempted a grab from the side, but Marcus spun free, using the inmate's momentum to slam him into the ground. The scuffle drew shouts and jeers, prompting more hound claws to close in. Marcus shifted his weight, recalling the close-quarters training that had once kept him alive in the field. The yard exploded into short bursts of violent impact. Marcus launched a knee into one man's abdomen, then pivoted to avoid a punch aimed at his head. The battered newcomer stumbled away, grateful for the reprieve. Onlookers watched with a mix of awe and fear as Marcus handled two more swings, forcing both assailants to retreat. Panting but steady, he refused to let the pressure overwhelm him. He was outnumbered, yet the ferocity he displayed shook the hound claws enough to disrupt their planned show. Cyrus stood apart from the melee, arms folded, calmly observing the clash. He signaled for his men to withdraw once he realized Marcus would not fall easily. Then Cyrus lifted his chin and locked eyes with his unintended adversary. His voice carried across the yard, dripping with contempt. He declared he would take personal responsibility for handling Marcus. The silent menace of that promise left no room for doubt. Cyrus had found a fresh target to destroy. A squad of guards arrived, armed with batons and uninterested in details. They saw blood on the concrete and pinned the blame on whoever looked like the primary aggressor. Marcus, surrounded by dazed inmates, had no chance to argue. He was hauled away under accusations of sparking disorder, while the hound claws slipped back into the crowd. That abrupt switch from hero to culprit proved how easily narratives twisted within these walls. Marcus ended up in solitary confinement, often referred to as the hole or the cage. A dim bulb lit the cramped space, reflecting off metal surfaces that radiated chill. Hours dragged in isolation, punctuated by the clang of a meal slot or a guard's mocking remark. He noticed a ragged etching on the wall near where he tried to rest, crudely carved letters spelling out a grim warning that his days were numbered. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured Cyrus's cold stare, remembered the silent circle of watchers, and recalled how quickly the guards had subdued him. The pressure from both the gang and the administration weighed on his mind. His act of courage in defending a helpless inmate seemed pointless. Solitude ate away at his morale, pushing him toward bleak reflections. Voices echoed in his head, telling him no one could challenge an inmate empire endorsed by a corrupt warden. Still, a flicker of resilience refused to die. He thought of the letter from Naomi Lawrence, the journalist who believed he could expose more than a mere local conspiracy. An unexpected break in the monotony arrived when Officer Banks appeared by the door. Without opening it fully, he slipped Marcus a small tape player with the recorded message. Banks spoke in hushed tones, admitting he was risking his job. Marcus took the device and waited until the guard departed before pressing play. Naomi's voice resonated through the tiny speaker, urging him to remain strong. She insisted she was closer to proving that his entire case had been faked. Her sources suggested that Solar Defense, the giant corporation linked to illicit arms deals, had labeled him an obstacle. She told him he was the one person with enough knowledge to reveal their criminal pipeline, which meant he was high on their hit list. Marcus leaned against the cold wall, letting Naomi's reassurance wash over him. She sounded unwavering, describing her belief that she could tie corrupt prison leadership to the broader scandal. She also mentioned that every new lead pointed to high-level manipulation, indicating that money flowed from corporate accounts to hush officials. This explained how Cyrus received resources for special jobs, how the warden turned a blind eye, and why every door to justice seemed shut. Naomi pleaded with Marcus not to give up, promising that the truth, once exposed, would shatter the fortress of lies containing him. After absorbing her words, Marcus recorded a short reply on the device, recapping the suspicious discussions he had overheard among inmates loyal to the Hound Clause. He mentioned references to external contacts who issued assignments or demanded swift eliminations. Handing the recorder back to Banks, he requested that the information go straight to Naomi. The guard looked uneasy but gave a terse nod. In that narrow corridor, neither man felt truly safe, but there was a sense of shared purpose, however fragile. Alone once more in the dim space, Marcus mulled over the precarious path ahead. He had revealed enough details to deepen Naomi's investigation, trusting her skill to stitch everything into a coherent argument against formidable adversaries. He could practically hear Cyrus's malicious vow reverberating in his mind. A short time had passed since that yard confrontation, yet the repercussions gripped his reality like a vice. The message scratched into the wall confirmed the gang's determination to finish him. Solitary confinement offered no real refuge, only a pause in the relentless storm bearing down on him. In spite of despair, he felt a stubborn fire within. The thought of shining a light on a corrupt system fueled his determination to endure, no matter the cost. While the walls pressed in, he clung to Naomi's voice, her pledge to uncover evidence that would clear his name and expose the power players behind these brutal schemes. If he emerged from solitary, he would face a wave of retaliation from Cyrus, plus ongoing schemes by Warden White. Yet the glimmer of hope sparked by Naomi's conviction carried him forward. Surviving here meant more than self-preservation. It meant advancing a cause that could topple men who thought they were invincible. Marcus slumped against the barren wall of the solitary cell, counting the chiseled scratches left by forgotten inmates. The meager space felt even smaller than before, with a flickering light overhead that turned every shadow into a looming phantom. Meals arrived irregularly. Cold scraps on a dented metal tray replaced any semblance of proper nutrition. The guards who delivered them rarely spoke, and even when they did, their voices were indifferent at best. Each time the slot in the door clanked, Marcus suspected a trick or a sudden assault. The walls eventually seemed to close in on him, and the notion of passing time became meaningless. Physical weakness crept over him, but the mental strain weighed even more. He fought the spiral by recalling old missions in places few people had heard of. In those memories, he and his unit operated with carefully choreographed precision, each soldier trusting the others to watch every angle. His closest friend once risked life and limb to pull him from a collapsed building. There had been a glorious sense of unity, a shared commitment to something larger than themselves. That same friend was among those who died in a later firefight, leaving Marcus with unshakable guilt. Whenever he closed his eyes, he visualized the smoke and the deafening roar of mortar shells. He saw their faces etched in shock, then gone. All that remained was the echo of final radio transmissions. By some twist of fate, Marcus survived. The memory of that inexplicable rescue haunted him now, in a cramped concrete box that threatened to devour his sanity. A ragged routine emerged, guided by sporadic clanks of the meal slot. At one point, Marcus noticed a faint smear of chalk left on the tray. It seemed out of place against the grimy metal and the typical lumps of unappetizing food. Curious, he concealed the tiny piece of chalk until he could inspect it more closely. When he finally had a moment, he knelt by the stained floor and tried to drag the chalk across the surface. To his surprise, certain letters were already faintly scrawled there, as though someone else had marked a clue. Proof with banks? The lettering was crude and hurried. Whoever left it must have risked punishment just to send that cryptic note. He stared at the words in disbelief. Through the punishing stillness of solitary confinement, a spark of possibility flared. He pictured Officer Banks, the man who had quietly shared an audio message from Naomi not too long ago. Could Banks be the originator of this message? Or perhaps Danny Bookman-Hawks, who possessed enough cunning to use stealth tactics, coordinated with the guard? Marcus had no way to confirm. All he knew was that someone wanted him to recognize a path forward. Gathering evidence against Cyrus Gray, Warden White, and the hidden powers behind them required more than guesswork. If Banks truly had documentation, records, recordings, or anything tangible, then Marcus's suspicions were about to cross into proof. Another stretch of isolation hammered at his mental defenses. The cell offered nowhere to walk, nowhere to stretch cramped limbs for more than a few paces. He tried to maintain muscle tone with push-ups and sit-ups, but the exhaustion from poor meals made each repetition an act of will. Every shuffle of steps in the corridor beyond his door set his heart racing, unsure if danger or salvation approached. When no one came for hours, he relived the anguish of watching his unit's final mission unravel. The swirl of dust, the collapsing ceilings, and the radio static felt more real than the cold presence of these prison walls. Yet with each recollection he reaffirmed a vow: if he survived that horror once, he would withstand another. Realizing that neither time nor isolation had broken him, he inhaled, letting battered lungs fill with stale air. A trace of resolve returned, reminding him that if he ever left this cramped cell, he intended to use every resource to rip open the facade concealing the corruption. The prison might have thought it could bury him indefinitely, but he refused to vanish like an unmarked file in a locked cabinet. The vow he formed was rooted in the same stubborn grit that got him through war zones. Cyrus was an obvious menace, reveling in his unchecked power, but Warden White controlled the environment that let Cyrus thrive. Behind them stood moneyed interests ready to crush anyone who saw too much. Marcus fixated on the chalk message. Proof with banks. If a single guard held the key, that meant the system was not monolithic. There were cracks, and through those cracks, a determined person could shine light onto rotten structures. He reminded himself of the outside world, of Naomi Lawrence, who pursued her investigation with fierce dedication, and the faint but present possibility that justice might reach into these concrete corridors. He could not collapse into despair, not when others believed in his innocence and risked exposure to help him. In the back of his mind, images of fallen comrades fueled him. They had died for missions that might never be publicized. It was time for him to fight on a different front, one where the enemy wore civilian clothes and operated behind polite smiles or bureaucratic forms. He clenched his fists, gazing up at the single naked bulb illuminating the cell. It might have only been a drab light, but in his imagination it became a beacon, urging him to persist. He pressed his fingertips against the etched message on the floor, silently promising that the final outcome would not be his quiet disappearance. He would confront Cyrus, the warden, and every shadowy figure who believed they could pull strings without consequence. Even if the confrontation cost him dearly, he had no intention of watching injustices multiply unchecked. This time, he was not just a soldier obeying orders. He was a lone fighter, forging a personal mission, reveal the tangled roots of corruption and emerge alive to speak about it. The cell might deny him physical freedom, but it could not lock away the renewed resolve burning in his core. Marcus stepped out of solitary confinement feeling a raw edge beneath his skin. The time spent in that cramped cell had left him thinner, with sharper angles in his face, yet a fierceness burned brighter in his eyes. Guards who led him through the corridor kept their distance, sensing that he was not as broken as they might have hoped. Every muscle in his body ached, and each footstep reminded him of the isolation he had just endured. He glanced around the cell block, noticing the wary looks from other inmates. Word traveled fast. Rumors said that Marcus had survived punishment meant to shatter him. He reached his usual bunk area and found a discreetly folded slip of paper tucked beneath a worn blanket. Naomi's familiar signature was scrawled at the bottom, and he carefully opened the note. She informed him that Solar Defense was far more than a corrupt corporate sponsor. It maintained illicit arms deals and had ties to underworld networks. Her sources had pieced together money trails showing how certain prison officials, likely including Warden White, had been receiving payments through shell accounts. She also wrote that Cyrus Gray's gang apparently served as local enforcers for jobs that required brute force within these walls. Reading each line stoked Marcus's anger at the scale of the conspiracy and renewed his commitment to tearing it down. A buzz of conversation drew his attention toward the communal walkway, where inmates were milling about. Cyrus appeared, moving with a self-assured stride. His eyes locked on Marcus and a small, mocking grin curved his lips. He made a show of nudging a henchman aside and stepped in close enough for the tension to thicken. One might have expected the typical intimidation routine, but Marcus met him with an icy stare that dared Cyrus to make a move. Days in solitary had fueled a certain defiance, and every line on Marcus's face told the story of a man who would not bow easily. Cyrus spoke with a low growl, implying that Marcus could be taken out at any moment, yet Marcus remained impassive. The Hound Claw's members edged closer, prepared to respond to their leader's command. Something about Marcus's posture, however, caused them to hesitate. Even the most vicious bullies sense when a target is no longer afraid of pain. Cyrus noticed the reluctance in his own men and scowled. He spat a vague threat about stepping up the game and vowed that Marcus would soon regret his insolence. Then he stormed off, barking at his lackeys to find a more cunning way to deal with their problem. Marcus exhaled slowly as the tension subsided. Heads turned away, and the usual hum of the block returned. He walked with measured steps, determined to reinforce the impression that he would not be cowed, no matter how many threats Cyrus issued. Deep inside, though, he recognized that an outright brawl might not be the biggest danger. A subtler plan, carefully orchestrated, could strike him down with no warning. He had to talk to Officer Banks. In the days before solitary, Marcus had discovered a clue on the floor of his cell, references suggesting that the guard held vital evidence. Now was the time to see if Banks would confirm any of it. Arranging a private moment in a prison rife with watchers demanded skill, but he managed to slip into a corner of the laundry area, noticing Banks inspecting some supplies. Marcus stepped forward, keeping his voice low. The guard looked startled, clearly aware of prying ears. Marcus addressed him directly, stating that he needed to hear the truth regarding the rumored documents and recordings. Banks scanned the empty aisle, then subtly nodded. He confessed to having digital copies of letters implicating Warden White in suspicious dealings, plus audio that captured the warden receiving instructions from Solar Defense affiliates. Banks whispered that the scale of the conspiracy terrified him, yet seeing Marcus endure so much had convinced him to share whatever he could. They exchanged hushed words. Banks clarified that he was willing to sneak the files to someone on the outside, as long as Marcus promised not to reveal the source. Marcus agreed, but pressed the guard about the risk of retribution. Banks swallowed hard, explaining that Cyrus enforced White's brand of authority. If a guard or inmate threatened to blow their cover, the Hound Claws would handle it swiftly. Cyrus had eyes everywhere, and the warden had enough sway to have Banks terminated from his post or worse. Marcus braced a hand on the wall, digesting that revelation. He asked whether Naomi Lawrence, a journalist already investigating the prison, could receive the evidence. Banks admitted he had heard the name and believed she might be the best channel for a controlled leak. Marcus's stomach churned at the possibility that Warden White or even someone higher up might intercept the handoff. Time was short, and nobody could predict how the warden would react if he caught a sniff of revolt. Banks agreed to set up a plan for transferring the digital proofs. He refused to disclose every detail, saying it was safer if Marcus knew only the basics. The less either party shared, the harder it would be for the warden to connect them. Marcus listened intently, aware that each step posed real peril for them both. Even a minor slip-up in timing could seal their fates. The conversation ended abruptly when another guard's footsteps echoed nearby. Banks muttered something about inventory, then turned away, maintaining the facade of routine work. Marcus made it look as though he was just there to fetch a towel. For an instant, their eyes met, conveying the unspoken agreement that they would risk everything to expose the wrongdoing at the core of this prison. Marcus left the laundry area with a renewed sense of urgency. Warden White and his puppet Cyrus had built a ruthless system, funneling bribes and executing sabotage to protect a hidden empire connected to solar defense. The knowledge that crucial evidence existed, combined with Naomi's vow to dig deeper, gave Marcus a shot at freedom in more ways than one. He had sworn to unmask those at the top, and now he had a chance to follow through, assuming he stayed alive long enough to see it done. Marcus eyed the dim corridor leading to the warden's office, sensing how narrow the margin for error had become. Danny Bookman Hawks clutched a small flashlight, and Officer Banks hovered at the rear, face drawn tight with concern. They had all agreed on a plan that involved breaching the administrative wing to secure critical documents linking Warden White to the powers behind solar defense. The unspoken fear was that a single misstep would invite a swift, brutal reprisal from Cyrus Gray's crew. The three crept past silent offices, guided by the flicker of the flashlight. Banks held a key card that bypassed the usual locks, though each beep made them flinch. At last, they reached a frosted glass door bearing the warden's name. Danny checked both ends of the hallway, and Banks quietly unlocked the door. Inside, the office was neat and cold, with a heavy filing cabinet lurking in one corner and a sleek computer on a polished desk. Marcus took station near the entrance while Banks powered up the machine. The guard's hands trembled as he navigated through folders, whispering that time was short. Danny found the cabinet partially open and began flipping through files. They discovered bank statements featuring suspicious deposit lines from SD Holdings, which lined up with Naomi Lawrence's revelations about illegal weapons deals. A second folder bore a list of inmates singled out for neutralization, supported by large sums that matched transfers from the same shell company. Marcus's pulse pounded as he realized the extent of White's involvement. These documents confirmed that the warden not only profited from the arrangement but also directed Cyrus to eliminate certain prisoners who might expose deeper truths. Banks moved quickly, transferring digital copies onto a hidden flash drive. He also photographed relevant pages. The adrenaline felt palpable, a hum in the air. Every moment in that office threatened to raise alarms or draw curious guards. Danny and Marcus listened for footsteps outside, each second an eternity. When Banks finished, he whispered a promise to stash the files in a safe spot until they could be passed to the outside. Marcus noticed the guard's pale face and realized that none of them would walk away unscathed if caught. They eased into the corridor again, heartbeats thumping with each step. Another beep of the key card sealed the warden's door, leaving no obvious sign of forced entry. The trio retreated toward the cell blocks, each carrying a piece of the plan that might topple White and bring the entire conspiracy to light. Marcus shook Danny's hand, and they parted ways in the dim break between wings. Banks slipped off to his normal post, trying to appear as though he had never left. Rumors soon reached the inmates that White's authority was not purely official. Word spread about payoff schemes and how Cyrus was little more than a mercenary, fulfilling the warden's violent orders for a price. Those who once feared or admired the Hound Claws began to question their loyalty. After all, if the gang was just a tool in White's pockets, did that mean all those displays of dominance were orchestrated for the warden's benefit? Some prisoners, especially those with grudges, whispered that Cyrus's grip had weakened. Reputations built on raw intimidation rarely survived revelations of subservience to a bigger fish. Marcus observed the shift. Conversations in the yard took on a sharper edge, and the usual hush around Cyrus's name faded. One or two inmates confronted a low-level Hound Claws member, accusing him of betraying fellow convicts for a few scraps of money. Fights flared up in lesser corners of the facility, with no direct link to Marcus, yet the tension unmistakably arose from the rumor that the gang served White's private agenda. This fracture in the power structure excited some detainees, who saw a chance to settle old scores. Others remained cautious, waiting to see how Cyrus would respond. Soon, an announcement echoed through the corridors. A committee on prisoner rights was planning a visit. Various sources claimed the commission was answering an onslaught of complaints about unchecked violence and corruption. For Marcus, the arrival of outside inspectors seemed like the perfect moment to expose White's operation. He already had an ally in Naomi, plus newly stolen evidence. The challenge was surviving until the committee actually set foot inside these walls. White could stage a series of crackdowns, and Cyrus might orchestrate a lethal accident before the visitors arrived. Marcus had no illusions about the warden ignoring these crucial days. Every suspicious inmate might be shoved into solitary or forced into a staged fight. The schedule for the commission's tour was not public knowledge, so White could easily manipulate events. That meant Marcus needed to coordinate with Danny and Banks right away, ensuring the vital files remained hidden and that Naomi received them in time. If everything aligned, the official presence of the committee would stop White from immediately burying the story. Naomi slipped him another note, relayed by a sympathetic staff member. She hinted that Solar Defense had grown uneasy about recent leaks. Individuals under that corporate umbrella were prepared to dismantle any evidence and silence anyone who delved too deep. Marcus gripped the note tightly, heart pounding with the realization that ruthless professionals might be gearing up for direct interference. This was no longer just a local prison scandal, it was an operation spanning multiple layers of power. He stowed the message and considered how quickly the discovered documents might vanish if White or Cyrus detected them. Already, the tension soared. The knowledge that an external force might intervene reawakened the survival instincts that had carried Marcus through covert missions. He understood that if he waited, the momentum might slip away. Acting boldly held risks, but waiting passively guaranteed a deadly outcome. Sweat beaded on his brow as he recalled the digital folders damning evidence of White's finances and the specific directives to neutralize troublemakers. Danny had confided that at least a few older inmates possessed their own grudges against White's system. Rumor said these men might throw their support behind Marcus if it meant dismantling the cycle of terror. He felt a grim sense of urgency pushing him forward. Any day, a wave of retaliation could strike. The commission's imminent arrival added pressure, intensifying White's paranoia. Marcus silently vowed to move first, presenting a completed puzzle of corruption before the warden realized how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. He needed only one chance to hand off the documents to the outside world, exposing every link from White's bank accounts to the bodies that littered the yard under Cyrus's watch. Each breath now seemed charged with possibility. Marcus clutched at the memory of solitary, where he had felt so close to the brink. This was his moment to strike. Retreat was not an option. Either he secured the evidence and used the commission's presence for protection, or he ended up another name on the warden's secret list. There was no time to hesitate. He read Naomi's note again, absorbing her warning that Solar Defense might soon eliminate every inconvenient trail. The only path left was to move faster than the powers arrayed against him, to act with the desperation and fury of a man who had nothing left to lose but the truth. Marcus stood near a makeshift exercise bench, scanning the block for any sign of Cyrus Gray. The tension in the air felt like a wire about to snap. A hush spread as Cyrus finally appeared with two henchmen close behind. Their footsteps echoed along the concrete, and people drew back instinctively, giving them room. Cyrus locked eyes with Marcus and signaled for the henchmen to keep watch. Then he offered a scornful grin and delivered his ultimatum. He proposed that Marcus voluntarily check into a form of protective isolation, staying out of sight until the visiting committee finished its tour. In exchange, Cyrus guaranteed Marcus would remain alive. If Marcus refused, the Hound Clause would ensure he never saw the committee's arrival. Cyrus's voice dripped with arrogance, suggesting the gang had already arranged everything with Warden White. Marcus clenched his fists but said nothing. The choice was clear: bend or die. Cyrus let the threat hang for a moment, then stalked off, leaving stunned silence in his wake. Word of the ultimatum soon reached Officer Banks, who found Marcus in a corner near the supplies closet. Lowering his voice, the guard explained that he had his own plan: an escape. He had connections that could facilitate a quiet exit from the prison. Banks insisted that no matter what happened with the commission, powerful interests like Solar Defense would not allow Marcus to keep breathing once the scandal broke. He claimed flight was the only way to survive. Marcus listened, tempted by the possibility of leaving these treacherous walls behind forever. Yet doubt weighed heavily. Running meant abandoning everyone who had been hurt by the corruption. It also meant letting Warden White and Cyrus continue their violent tyranny unchecked. Marcus paced back and forth, wrestling with the idea that exposing the truth might lead to his death anyway. Eventually, he told Banks he needed time to think, though both knew the window for decisions was shrinking. The guard squeezed his shoulder in an unspoken gesture of support before slipping away. Marcus tried to envision himself scaling a fence or climbing into the back of a truck, becoming a fugitive who might never clear his name. The thought felt like betrayal, especially after all the sacrificed inmates who lacked even a sliver of hope. During his darkest moments in solitary, he had sworn to bring the entire scheme crashing down, no matter the cost. Shadows stretched across the block as Marcus stared at the faces around him, men battered by the system, living in fear of Cyrus's next whim. Some silently rooted for him. Others avoided eye contact, suspecting association with him would bring trouble. Deep inside, Marcus reached a conclusion. He refused to vanish as if guilty. The real criminals lurked among corporate offices and the prison's upper echelon. If he fled, nobody would confront them. He decided to stand firm, fully aware that Cyrus's threat carried lethal weight. He met Banks again, this time alone in a narrow hall near the administrative zone. Marcus declared that he would not run. Instead, he asked Banks to pass digital copies of the incriminating documents directly to Naomi Lawrence. She could then expose everything at exactly the right moment. Banks exhaled, torn between relief and dread. He agreed to help but warned that surviving the Hound Claw's wrath would be difficult. Marcus nodded, stating that he no longer intended to hide. Next came preparations for the imminent arrival of the committee. Marcus and Danny Bookman Hawks put their heads together. Danny volunteered to stir conversation among inmates who were fed up with Warden White's collusion. If they all demanded the right to speak freely when the committee walked in, no last-minute lockdown could silence everyone. Marcus planned to present the smuggled evidence in full view, hoping the committee's presence would deter a violent crackdown. Rumors suggested that White was still finalizing some grand display of order to fool the inspectors. The Hound Claws might stage a riot or target Marcus directly at the critical juncture. Even so, he resolved to go through with it, believing that a public reckoning was the only path to true justice. He took a moment to reflect on the path behind him: solitary confinement, near-death encounters, covert deals with a fearful guard. All roads led to this final stand. Before parting ways, Danny placed a small, handwritten note in Marcus's hand, reminding him that half the prison was quietly rooting for his success. Nobody wanted to remain forever crushed under the warden's corrupt regime. Marcus clutched the paper and inhaled a steadying breath. Courage did not mean absence of fear. It meant forging ahead despite every reason to turn back. He had come too far to bow to Cyrus's ultimatum or slip away like a runaway convict. The plan for exposure was in motion, and time was running out. Marcus stood against the cold wall in a corridor that had been scrubbed to impress a team of distinguished visitors. A few well-dressed individuals walked through the cell blocks, guided by Warden White. The atmosphere felt artificially calm, with uniformed guards attempting to mask every hint of tension. Word had spread that this committee was investigating prison conditions, and the administration was desperate to hide how the system truly worked. Marcus watched as White pointed out newly painted walls and boasted about rehabilitation programs that barely existed. Suddenly, distant shouts erupted. Danny Bookman Hawks had rallied a group of inmates, urging them to demand a proper audience with the commission. Their voices boomed across the halls, shaking the artificial veneer of order. The stunned committee members halted, unsure if they should continue following White or turn toward the loud pleas for help. White tried to wave it off as a minor disturbance, but the noise grew louder, and confusion rippled through the corridors. Marcus realized Danny was doing exactly what he had promised, creating a scene that no official whitewash could ignore. A wave of movement surged through the hallway. Cyrus Gray seized the opportunity to strike, pulling Marcus aside where the visitors could not see. Two of Cyrus's henchmen blocked the route, forcing Marcus into a narrower stretch near a storage room. The gang leader's eyes burned with rage and desperation. He recognized that his window of influence was slamming shut. With a snarl, he lunged. A sharpened metal shard glinted in his hand, and the clash erupted in raw violence. Marcus threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding a blow aimed at his ribs. Past brushes with danger lent him reflexes that saved him from a fast end. He countered with a driving elbow, catching Cyrus in the chest. The corridor rattled with shouts and dull impacts. Marcus focused on disarming the weapon first, blocking a wild slash with his forearm. Sparks of pain shot through him, but he managed to wrench the blade free and send it clattering across the floor. Cyrus, undeterred, hurled punches, each one fueled by his fierce hatred. Some members of the Hound Claws hovered at the edges, but hesitated under the weight of this final stand. They saw the ruthless gleam in Cyrus's eyes and sensed that everything was spiraling out of control. The gang's unity cracked, and most backed away. Cyrus found himself nearly alone, consumed by vengeance. Marcus landed a knee strike, his breath ragged. Blood trickled from a cut on his arm, but he kept pressing forward, determined to stop Cyrus once and for all. With a surge of strength, he tackled the gang leader to the ground. Cyrus tried to twist free, spewing curses. He shouted that Solar Defense owned everyone, that they had financed every dirty deed. His voice echoed off concrete walls, unraveling any illusion that the warden acted alone. At that moment, the committee members and several guards turned the corner, drawn by the commotion. Their eyes fell on the blood-stained floor and the battered men. Marcus, catching sight of them, raised his voice, yelling that corruption ran from White's office to powerful external sponsors. He gestured at Cyrus, who continued ranting about corporate money and cover-ups. Marcus demanded that these officials open their eyes. The scene was visceral proof of the violence that the administration had tried to conceal. Officer Banks rushed forward, clutching a folder of incriminating files. Shaken but resolute, he handed the documents to a startled commission representative. Confusion swept through the watchers, and Warden White lost his composure, shouting that it was all fabricated. His frantic denial fell flat as more inmates gathered, some of them shouting about the warden's secret deals and Cyrus's paid hits. Danny emerged from a side hallway, limping badly, but determined to confirm the truth. A sudden crack rang out, an accidental blow or possibly a stray projectile, and Danny collapsed to the ground. Marcus's heart lurched. He crouched beside his friend, seeing the pained shock in Danny's eyes. Guards and commission members quickly intervened, calling for medics. White was confronted on the spot with the evidence of his wrongdoing. Within moments, news spread that the warden would be removed pending a full investigation. The committee recorded statements from the injured, from terrified witnesses, and from Marcus himself. The chain of events had become too public to ignore. Marcus ended up in the medical wing, bandages wrapped around fresh wounds. Word reached him that Danny's condition was serious, and doctors were fighting to stabilize him. Soon afterward, an official stepped in to inform Marcus that his case was being reopened. The findings from Banks and Naomi had triggered a judicial review, and further inquiries into Solar Defense ties were already underway. Days passed in a blur of medical checks and urgent discussions about the evidence. Eventually, the door to the infirmary opened, and a guard informed Marcus that he was free. He gathered a few belongings, just worn clothes and the intangible burden of what he had witnessed. Stepping outside the prison gates, he paused. The victory he had secured felt hollow. Danny remained hospitalized, and many inmates still dealt with the scars of White's regime. Marcus inhaled the open air, haunted by the knowledge that cleaning out corruption demanded more than one dramatic confrontation. He stood with a small bag in hand, gazing at the world beyond the walls. The official record would now reflect his innocence, but there were countless others who had not escaped the system. He remembered faces twisted by fear and hopelessness, reminded of how deep the rot ran. Quietly, he vowed he would not stop fighting. The cost of exposing the truth had been steep, yet the alternative, silence, would have been worse. With that final thought, he stepped forward, determined to ensure that his hard-won freedom would mean something not just for himself, but for everyone still trapped in the shadows.